Good morning, everyone. It's been a little bit since I've seen you. Hold on. Gotta adjust. All right. Good morning. Welcome to Get Ready with Me and Talk About Stuff. My name is Stephanie McCown. Welcome to the show. So it's been a little bit between spring break and then my son got sick and life happened. It's been a couple weeks since I've been here, and it feels really nice to be back to recording because I miss you guys when I don't get to do this. So how are you? Welcome to the show. This show is not about anything in particular. The topics vary from week to week. And this week's topic is one that I've been reading up on for a little bit, and I really think it's something you're going to enjoy, but I do want to warn you, I am going to be sharing some medical aspects of the story that some people might find uncomfortable, and I will be showing a couple of pictures. So if that's something that bothers you, you can skip ahead in those parts and listen to the rest of the story, because I think it's really good and I think you'll enjoy it. If you are not a subscriber yet and talking about random things while putting on makeup is kind of your thing, I encourage you to hit that subscribe button, share this video with your friends, invite them along for the party, because the more the merrier. Also, if you would like to contribute to supporting future content, I've left some links in the description that offer you a variety of ways that you can do exactly that. So, without further ado, let's get started. So, as I mentioned, what I'm going to talk to you about today is something that actually to this day has a far-reaching impact, and it started off well, why don't I just tell you the story? So in 1898, Marie and Pierre Curie discovered radium, and when they discovered this element, it was like a miracle had happened. It is not an element that is easy to suss out. It takes work, it takes knowledge, and the fact that they managed to do that and managed to isolate it was and is something that is remarkable. And it was immediately hailed as something of a miracle element. One aspect of radium that caught people's attention was that it glowed, and this was something that, of course, in 1898 was pretty dang exciting. So aside from that, though, there was a lot of interest in finding out what this element could do, because as I said, it was very hard to isolate, and it was believed that there was a lot of potential for this element to be of benefit to all of humankind. So that happened in 1898. Now in 1901, scientists discovered that radium, it could destroy human tissue, and it could also destroy tumors. So they started using it as a means to combat cancer, and they tried to harness other health benefits from the radium, and just began using it as medicine. Now in 1903, though, Pierre Curie warned, you know what, you guys, this is really awesome, this is a really cool element, and we're loving it, but it's also very dangerous, and you need to use it very cautiously, because not only can it injure you, it can also kill you. So that was in 1903, but unfortunately, the radium craze had already begun. At that point, as I mentioned, it was being used for medicinal purposes. And over time, it would start to be put in cosmetics, it would be put in soaps, it would be put in toothpastes, it would be put in small amounts in many of the things that people consumed or used every day, because it was believed that a tiny amount of radium, not only was it not going to hurt you, but would it actually help you. And I'm sure the Curies are watching this and being like, yeah, I think this is probably a really bad idea, but, I think once things take off, it's really difficult to harness them in. I think once something has caught on, it's like trying to put the toothpaste back in the tube. It just simply is not going to be done. So people were warned that it was a dangerous substance. Nevertheless, they continued using it. Now, in 1906, the French Academy of Medicine reported the death of a lab worker who had been working with radium. They experienced radium burns, and they ended up dying from the exposure. Did that stop anybody? Let's find out. So in 1914, the American Medical Association added radium to its list of new and unofficial remedies. So a very well-respected organization was saying, you know, for all that, you know, radiation burns and whatnot, radium is still okay with us. We're still good with it, and we think that you could probably use it medicinally, and that would be fine. And boy, did people use it medicinally. They also, as I mentioned, were putting it in their cosmetics. If you were to look at vintage ads for radium, you would see that it was touted as a means for women to, you know, well, to look radiant. So they would put it in face powders and creams and so forth. It would be put in toothpaste so that when you brush your teeth will look radiant. There was radium-infused water, so you could drink it, and, you know, you could, like, you know, restore your healthful glow by drinking radium. And it just took off. Now, in 1914, World War I started. And this would create unforeseen opportunities for people, you know, in many industries. But the radium industry especially was going to benefit from the tragedy of war. I mean, war is tragic. There's really no other way to say that. War is tragic. So in 1916, oh, I missed something here. Before this, so before 1916, and I don't have the year right in front of me, I apologize. Sabin von Suchocki, I believe is his name. Let me see here. Yeah, this was in 1913. So he invented like radium paint. He patented it as undark. And what he found was that you could use radium dust combined with water and a glue of some kind, and you could create luminous paint. And this would be something that would end up changing the world for everyone, and it would change the lives of many people in the years to come. And you're going to find out exactly what I mean as we continue. So World War I started, and what that meant was, you know, industries of various kinds opened up, and people had the opportunity to make some money, and people also had the opportunity for good paying jobs that just didn't exist prior to the war. So in 1916, the Radium Luminous Materials Corporation opened in Orange, New Jersey. And what they did was they contracted with the military to paint, oops, you know, I thought when you turned on Do Not Disturb on your phone, it literally meant Do Not Disturb, but apparently I am incorrect because I get calls coming in and it's really annoying. So if somebody knows how I can do this correctly, I would love it if you would tell me. But anyway, so that what they did is they contracted with the United States military to paint dials. They would paint watch dials, clock dials, they would paint dials for instrument panels, and they would paint it with this undark. And that was something that was happening anyway. And then when the United States entered World War I, then it just really, the industry really took off. Now, a year later, the Radium Dial Corporation would open in Ottawa, Illinois, and they were contracting with a company called Westclocks. And I vaguely remember seeing clocks by Westclocks, like when I was a kid, but they were exclusively about painting dials for this clock and watchmaking company. That's all they did. So in 1917, hold on, I'm just trying to, yeah. So in 1917, the United States entered World War I, and the contracts for the what would become the United States Radium Corporation, located in Orange, New Jersey, they would just go through the roof. So they ended up having to hire a lot of people. Now, a lot of the people they hired, they specifically wanted to hire young girls. And I mean like girls in their early to mid-teens, sometimes women in their early 20s, but primarily they wanted to hire these young girls because it was their belief that the younger girls had, because their hands were small and dainty and so forth, that they would be better suited for handling the delicate and precise work of painting these dials that the United States Radium Corporation made, more so than men or adult women. So they would hire these girls as young, there were some girls as young as 11 years old working at the United States Radium Corporation, which to our modern minds is just shocking, but it's important to understand that back then, not only were the laws different, but the United States Radium Corporation and other radium, dial painting studios around the country, they paid very well. There was a lot of potential to make a decent living as a dial painter. So the United States Radium Corporation hired a whole bunch of young girls to work at they called them studios, to work at these dial painting studios. And they would teach them a technique to help them maintain a fine point on their brush so that they could do the delicate work of dial painting and make it look crisp and neat on the dial. So what they would do is they would take a brush, and I'll just use this as an example. I'm not going to actually do it, but I'll show you. So they had like a brush with a very fine point on it to begin with, but they had to be precise. They had to be very exact in how they painted these dials. So what they would do is they would put the brush in their mouth and then pull it through their lips to make that fine point even more fine. Then they would dip it in the radium, in the compound that they created, and then they would paint the dial. Then they would do the whole, or they'd paint a number on, and then they would do the whole thing again, many times for every number, and for the hands on the dial, the lines in between, anything that had to be painted between each thing they would do. It was called lip dip paint, and that was the technique the girls were taught to keep their brushes so that they could paint with precision. And these girls would do this for 8, 9, 10 hours a day. They would do it thousands of times a day, and sometimes they would do it 6 or 7 days a week. That was standard, and that was just what they were taught to do. So that was what they did. Now, as time would go on, what they learned was that, hey, this radium dust that is floating in the air, it actually has the really cool property of glowing. The girls, keep in mind, these are teenage girls, okay? The oldest among them is probably, the oldest is maybe 20. But most of these were just teenage girls who were excited to have their job. They were making their own money, and they were like, this is awesome. I'm bringing in income, and I'm at this job that I enjoy. I get to sit at the table with other dial painters, and these girls would become good friends. And as teenage girls are wont to do, they really thought that the fact that the substance they were working with glowed was actually pretty dang cool. So what they would do is, as they're painting, they would sometimes paint their nails. They would put the radium on their lips, wear it as lipstick. They would use it for, just general makeup. They would, if they were going out that night, they would wear the dress that they were going to wear to the dance hall, because the radium dust would coat their dress, and then their dress would glow when they went out later. So they were like, this is really cool. And, I'm 45 years old, and I would still probably be like, oh my gosh, that is so cool. I want to wear glow-in-the-dark things. In between, when they were on break, they would, as I mentioned, they would play with it as makeup. Then they would go into like a dark room and just look at each other glowing. And they thought that was pretty awesome. It would also coat their hair. They would eat at their tables. That was where they would have their lunch. And the dust would get into their food, it would get into their drinks, so they're eating it. And they were told it was safe. They were told, you know, this is a perfectly safe substance. It's not going to harm you. And, you know, radium, the United States Radium Corporation really didn't think anything of it. They were just like, hey, you know what? These girls are willing to work. They are good at what they do. They're churning out thousands of dials per day. We're happy. We're making a lot of money. So it's important to understand this job was also considered an elite job. A lot of the girls who worked there they came from families that were, you know, they were poor. And finding a job like this was just a stroke of amazing fortune to be hired there. They were paid more than 3 times the average wage of any other factory. And they were considered some of the top, so dial painters ranked in the top 5% of female workers nationally. So these weren't just, you know, run-of-the-mill jobs. These were elite jobs that these girls were proud to have, and they were excited to share it with other people. And what they would do is they would tell their friends, they would tell, I'm sorry, I misplaced my eyeshadow primer. I'm trying to find that while I talk to you. They would tell their friends, they would tell family members, they would invite people to come along with them because they thought this was an awesome job and they wanted to share the joy with the people they cared about. So, you know, you would end up having at one studio several sisters working together, best friends working together, because these girls were so excited about this job, they could not keep it to themselves. So they invited friends along to join them in their incredible stroke of amazing fortune. Which, you know, I get that. Where I come from, factory jobs were at one time considered the jobs to get. And I would imagine that a job like that, where you're being paid to sit and hang out with your friends all day and paint glow-in-the-dark things, would be kind of cool, especially if it paid better than the average job. So you have all these young girls and their friends working at these factories, and everything seems great, right? Everybody's making money, everybody's happy. Well, in 1918, World War I ends, and shortly thereafter is when our story really begins to unfold. So we're going to talk about Molly. I believe her last name is spelled Magia, or it's pronounced Magia. So she was one of the girls that they hired to work at the at the United States Radium Corporation. And she had been working there a few years, and she just started not feeling well. She just thought she needed rest. She just didn't understand why she was so fatigued, figured she'd just been working too hard. And then she had a toothache. And again, she's like, well, you know, a toothache isn't anything to, you know, worry too much about. I'll just go to my dentist and have the dentist look at it, and I'm sure I'll be fine. So she went to her dentist. The dentist looked at her tooth and decided it just needed to come out. So the dentist pulled her tooth. Well, then the next tooth in line also began to hurt and also would end up needing to be pulled. Now, that doesn't sound like a big deal. I mean, yeah, I'm sure it hurt, but, you know, is it a health crisis to have your teeth pulled? Generally speaking, probably not. But the problem was her mouth wasn't healing. Where her teeth had been pulled, she ended up developing ulcers, and these ulcers would bloom like flowers, and they would just seep pus. So she's got these painful teeth. Now she's got sores in her mouth from where her teeth were pulled. She's not feeling any better. She's not her energy is not returning to her. She's in pain. She doesn't really know what's going on. She had so much pain in her limbs that it would leave her unable to walk at times. And that would happen more and more frequently as this mysterious infection she had progressed. She would just be in so much pain she couldn't carry on with her normal day-to-day life. Now, her doctor told her that she had rheumatism and sent her home with aspirin. Well, that didn't really help. That was not helpful at all. So by May of 1922, she had lost most of her teeth, and her unknown illness was beginning to spread. To give you some context, to give you an idea of how, of how ill she actually was, by the time, so her entire lower jaw, the roof of her mouth, some bones in her ears, they all became one large, aching, oozing, painful abscess. I cannot even imagine what that must have felt like. That must have been horrific pain for this young woman to be experiencing. And nobody knew what was wrong with her. Nobody could figure it out. So she went back to her dentist because, again, her teeth were still hurting. They were bothering her tremendously. She went to her dentist to have him look at her jaw again. And as he's looking, he's very gently looking at her jaw, just very gently poking around in there. Her jaw actually breaks. A piece of her jaw broke off, and the dentist was able to lift it out of her mouth with his fingers. That's how delicate her jaw had become by this mysterious illness she had. And then, shortly thereafter, her entire lower jaw would be removed in exactly that way. The dentist didn't have to use instruments or anything. He could just reach in her mouth, pull, and there's Molly's jaw. So on September 22nd, 1922, this mysterious infection that had been eating through Molly's body, it ate through, and now keep in mind, this is less than a year since the onset of her symptoms. Less than a year, okay? This infection that she had, that had eaten through her jaw, that had caused her pain in all of her joints, that had caused her to have to quit her job. It had just turned her life absolutely upside down. It ate a hole in her jugular vein. Her mouth filled up with blood. And at 5 p.m. that evening, she passed away. She bled out so quickly that the nurse, I'm guessing she had home health care of some kind at this point, she bled out so fast there was nothing that could be done to stop it. Nothing. She was 24 years old when she died. So that's terrible, right? Well, then on her death certificate, it was said that she died from syphilis. Now, I will be the first to admit I don't know a lot about how syphilis progresses, but I am pretty sure that in all of the things I've ever learned about syphilis, because I watch a ton of documentaries about weird stuff, and syphilis comes up now and then, I have never heard of it acting that way. But that was what was put on her death certificate, that she died of syphilis. Shortly after Molly's death, other dial painters also began to fall ill and die. So what is going on with these dial painters? Why are they experiencing this? Because this was not something, they had been told that what they were doing was safe, and people were beginning to think, they were beginning to connect the dots that These dial painters are dying. The one thing they all have in common is they all worked at this place where they painted radium dials. Is there something to this? Now, there had been studies of radium done, but up to a point, the studies that were done on the safety of radium were done by people who had a vested interest in telling the public radium was safe. There was a lot of money to be made with radium. Radium was a rare element. It was expensive, but people were loving it. So it really served these people well to convince the public that radium was perfectly safe. If they had said, you know, hey, we're not, you know, hey, by the way, did you know Pierre Curie said that radium could kill you? If they had told the public this, you know, it really would have hurt their bottom line. And keep in mind, so this is, you know, the early 1900s. These days, it's easy for us to get information on the things that we're putting into our bodies. If we want to know if something is safe, we can find out pretty easily. That was not the case back then. I mean, you were really having to trust in these corporations to be honest with you about what their product will do to your body, if there's any risk involved, etc., and so on and so forth. So there was probably not a lot of big deal made about the fact that one of the people who had discovered radium also said radium is dangerous and it will kill you and you probably shouldn't be messing with it. After the dial painters began dying, though, there were independent studies performed to question the safety of radium. And these studies concluded, without any question, that radium was in fact very harmful. And it certainly is not something you should be handling casually, and it's definitely not something you should be putting into your body. Nevertheless, these radium dial painting companies kept doing what they'd been doing all along and had all of these young girls continue their work as dial painters and churned out thousands of dials per day because obviously these companies wanted to keep making money. I mean, that's what they were there for. They were there to make money. So they weren't too concerned about what these independent studies showed because these corporations had enough money and enough power to be able to pay their own experts to perform a study and say, well, we don't agree with the independent study. Here's what we found. And, you know, we know that still happens today. Corporations that have the money to do, like, do you remember, for example, maybe I should do a video on this sometime, when Coca-Cola conducted a study saying that sugar was not harmful? That sugar was not going to be the source of any serious physical health conditions, and it was perfectly safe to consume in the quantities that Americans consume sugar. And, you know, it kind of loses all credibility when you find out it was Coca-Cola that sponsored the study, because of course they want people to think it's okay to consume as much sugar as the average American does, which, as you might have guessed, is a lot. So, you know, the studies that the radium corporations would fund, unsurprisingly, would find, you know, hey, radium's not harmful. Are you kidding me? Radium's great. If it was harmful, would they be putting it in medicine? I don't think that we're at all far removed from an argument of that nature even today. Yeah, they would put it in medicine even if it was harmful. Are you kidding me? Okay, so in 1924, the term radium jaw was first mentioned in literature. What is radium jaw? Well, as I mentioned, the dial painters used the lip dip paint method for their work. And what they found was that these girls, their jaws would begin to just literally fall apart. And it was because the radium was causing their jawbones to actually get like a honeycombed effect. It was eating through their bones, and the bones looked like honeycombs. And that meant that the girls would lose teeth. They would lose whole chunks of their jaw all at once. They would develop abscesses in their mouths. You know, it was a very incredibly painful, you know, kind of gross, unavoidable consequence of the work that they were doing. The work they had been told by people they trusted was safe to do. So USRC, as you would imagine, then pays for independent pays for their own studies that would contradict the findings of the independent studies. And what they would end up saying was that these girls who were falling ill had been ill before, but they were trying to get the United States Radium Corporation they were trying to palm off their illnesses to get the United States Radium Corporation to pay for their treatment, basically. They were saying, you know, these girls were sickly, they had poor health to begin with, you know, kind of like, why did we even bother hiring them, etc., etc., and basically said that these girls were just scamming the company to try to get the company to pay for their treatment. Which, you know, you hear about it, and I think from our 2021 perspective, that seems it seems like a horrible thing for a company to do, but I think we'd be foolish to think that there are no companies today that still would do that in a heartbeat if they could. If their employees were getting sick from something that they were doing, and if they could get away with it, they absolutely 100% would. I mean, the United States Radium Corporation, it didn't do anything that modern corporations wouldn't at least attempt. And I think that's a sad fact. I mean, you know, it's easy to look at the monstrous ways the United States Radium Corporation behaved, and it gets worse, trust me, and think, oh gosh, what terrible people. But and they are terrible people, but it's really not that different from what people would do, or what these corporations would do and probably have done and are doing, thinking that, you know, maybe they can get by with it. So in 1925, Dr. Harrison Martland devised tests to prove conclusively that radium had poisoned the dial painters. Now, what's interesting about this is this test only came about after a man died. One of the men who worked at the United States Radium Corporation passed away from radium poisoning. And only then did people start to think, hey, maybe there's something to this. And, you know, obviously that's just a load of crap, isn't it? So these women had been saying for years at this point that the radium is making us sick. You told us it was safe, it's making us sick. And every effort was made to call these women liars, to call them cheats, and to, you know, besmirch their reputation by saying they're actually dying of syphilis, not radium poisoning, whatever. So it was discovered during these tests that ingesting the radium, rather than just putting it on your skin or on your dress or hair, as the case may be, actually was like 1,000 times more dangerous than, you know, not ingesting it. So these girls, think about it. So they're painting these dials. They're doing lip dip paint thousands of times per day. Now, it's a tiny amount of radium probably was safe, as the powers that be said it was. But these girls, because of how often they did lip dip paint through the day, they were not just ingesting a small amount of radium. They were taking in significant quantities of radium every single day they worked. And some of them did this work for years. And what Dr. Martland's studies found was that the radium would act on the human body like calcium, meaning it would get into your bones, it would get into your bone marrow, and whereas calcium works to strengthen the body, the radium would get into the bone marrow and start depleting it, and at the same time continuing to emit radiation the entire time. So these dial painters, ingesting this stuff every single day, their bones were starting to honeycomb. They would, as we mentioned, they would lose teeth. You know, they would develop these ulcers in their mouths that would just ooze pus all the time, all day, every day, 7 days a week. And there was nothing that could be done to help them. So the result of the radium poisoning on their bodies were, you know, they would get spontaneous fractures, you know, just going about their day, doing their thing, and they would get a fracture in their leg or their arm or something, you know. For some of the women, their spines would get, quote, crushed, meaning that their vertebra had been so deteriorated it just started collapsing. And some of the women, one woman in particular, I believe it was Grace Fryer, who we'll meet formally in a few minutes, her spine was so deteriorated she couldn't even stand up anymore. Her body just, she couldn't hold herself up. Her doctor had to devise basically a steel cage back brace for her to wear that it went from like just below her armpits down to like mid-thigh, because that's how deteriorated her spine was, and she had to wear it all day long. She could only take it off for 2 minutes at a time, and she had to wear that for the rest of her life because, you know, her body wasn't getting better. It was in fact gradually getting worse, and she could not take the brace off because otherwise she wouldn't be able to hold herself up. And, you know, that was just how it was. There was nothing that could be done about it. So she had to wear this brace. I can't even imagine how uncomfortable that must have been, especially not being able to take it off. I mean, yeesh. I mean, I know how much I complained last summer when I had my cast on because I had surgery on my ankle. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so uncomfortable. I can't even imagine wearing a steel cage on my body, you know, all day long and all night and only be able to take it off for 2 minutes at a time. I can't even imagine. Now, here's another thing. Even their breath was radioactive. So these women, I mean, they were knowingly exposed to something. Now, knowingly not by them, but by the people in positions of power. These women were knowingly exposed to something that had every potential and every likelihood of killing them. And that's just, you know, that was just how it was. I mean, these women were considered expendable. And I want to do a sidebar for a minute here, because I think this needs to be said. A couple things need to be said here. So, I am not conservative, but I am surrounded by conservatives most of the time. In part because of where I live, in part because my family is very conservative, etc., etc. Now, one thing that I often hear from conservatives is the family structure was well intact until women went to work in the 1970s. Well, I have news for you. Women have always worked. Women have always worked. It wasn't a new thing for women, in general terms, to go to work. What was unusual in the 1970s was that middle-class white women decided they wanted to get a job and make their own money, which is fine. That's great. No problem. But I think it's dismissive of the poor women and a lot of women of color who have worked all along, because when you're poor, you don't have the option to just not work. Unlike a lot of the women who decided in the 1970s that, hey, I would like to go to work because that sounds fun. These women didn't have a choice. They had to work to survive. So it's really a misrepresentation to say that women didn't work until the 1970s, because women certainly did, but just not middle-class white women. In fact, a lot of the women who did work were, many of them were working in service to white women. So that's the first thing. Secondly, it's worth noting that a lot of what was happening with the radium, not only was it happening to women, but it was specifically happening to poor women who didn't have a choice but to work. So these women were considered expendable because of their status, because of their lack of standing in a society that basically saw them as and treated them as expendable. I don't think that you can get around this whole story I'm telling you without looking at that aspect of it. This was a problem that was happening to women of lesser means, women who took these jobs because they believed it would advance them and it would advance their families and finally give them a firm foothold on the life they wanted to live. And having that stolen from them by people who knew better, by people who should have, I think it's kind of maybe a little bit naive to think that corporations should have protected them, but at least when the women asked directly, is this safe? Because some of them did, and they were told it was. I think that's horrible. All right, I'm going to finish this up, and then I will be right back. As always, I hope you'll hang with me and hear the rest of this. Hey, I am back. Like I said, I enjoy glow-in-the-dark things. So what are these dial painters going to do? They're getting sick. They're dying. Nobody's really listening to them. Their employers are looking for every way they can to invalidate them and basically avoid taking any responsibility at all for what these women are going through. But these women are not going to just accept that. In 1925, Marguerite Carlo became the first person to sue the United States Radium Corporation. The goal of she had been diagnosed with radium poisoning. She knew she was not going to be around for long. The goal of the lawsuit and of future lawsuits was not so much for protecting herself, because it was a foregone conclusion. There was nothing more that could be done for her, but was designed to hold the corporation accountable for the benefit of, future employees and, everyone in general, basically. But what happened with Marguerite, I believe it was, I tried to find a definitive answer on this, and I'm sure I saw it, but it just escaped my mind. I believe she died before anything could really be done with her lawsuit. Either that, it might have been thrown out entirely, because it's important to understand the United States Radium Corporation was very powerful. They were very wealthy. They had unlimited resources to deal with these lawsuits. They didn't care. It was like, go ahead, hit me with your best shot. You have no chance of anything happening with this little lawsuit you're filing. So, as far as I know, nothing much happened with Marguerite's lawsuit, but that would not be the last of their troubles for the United States Radium Corporation. Now, it's important to note that at the time of Marguerite's lawsuit, and even in years to come, radium poisoning was not considered a compensable disease. So there was such a thing as workers being compensated for diseases that they, that occurred because of their occupation, but radium poisoning was not on the list of compensable diseases. So, Marguerite Carlo was really asking for the moon, and thank goodness she did, because she would pave the way for future lawsuits to come. So in 1925, or I'm sorry, in 1927, Grace Fryer and several others ended up suing the United States Radium Corporation. They would they found an attorney who was willing to represent them, and they filed a class action suit against the company. Now, their attorney, Raymond Barry, I think was his name, he said, when you have been told, or when you have heard you are going to die, that there is not hope, and every newspaper you pick up prints what really amounts to your obituary, there is nothing left. So he knew he was dealing with a time-sensitive case. He knew that these women were desperate for some kind of justice for themselves, for their families, for future dial painters. He understood that, you know, he was going up against a large corporation, but he felt perfectly confident doing so because he knew that justice would be on the side of these women, or at least that was the hope. Now, what these women were up against were all kinds of things, like there was a statute of limitations. It's important to know that you can have radium poisoning and you might not have symptoms for several months. You know, you might not know you're sick until long after it happened, but the statute of limitations at the time said you only had a relatively short amount of time to take action, you know, from the time you are sick until you only had that certain amount of time to take action. And it was not enough because radium poisoning, because of the way it worked, the statute of limitations would have run out before the women even knew they were sick. And so they were up against, a giant, and they knew this. Now, when Grace Fryer sued the company, and that class action lawsuit took place, this was a different case because there had been more deaths, because they learned from Marguerite Carlo's lawsuit. They knew what they had a better idea of what they were up against, and they were better prepared, and the case would take on a life of its own. People would, all around the world, would hear about this case, and they were watching it very closely. And it raised awareness for the first time that dial painters were dying. I mean, it was well known in the community where these things were happening, but in general, people just didn't know until this case. And then people started realizing that not only were these women suffering terribly, and they had essentially been given a death sentence, but also that the United States Radium Corporation was determined to run out the clock on these women. In fact, during the lawsuit, the United States Radium Corporation actually asked the judge for a delay so that members of, those who were being sued, the United States Radium Corporation, some people in that party could basically go take their summer vacation as they had planned and not be sidetracked by this petty little lawsuit and these dying women. And the judge agreed. The judge let them do it, which is just shocking to me, but they did. And obviously, it's not a stretch at all to say that the hope was they could run out the clock on these women and that these women would die before the United States Radium Corporation had to do anything. Now, because the lawsuit was getting the attention it was getting, the dial painters in Ottawa, Illinois started paying attention, and they're like, well, wait a minute, if it's dangerous for them, it's dangerous for us too. Now, it's important to note that the two radium dial painters, or dial painter, you know what I mean, you know the thing, they used different processes for their paint. So the process that was used at the United States Radium Corporation in Orange, New Jersey, it acted more quickly on the women's bodies than the one in Ottawa, Illinois did. So, at that point, they didn't know a lot of women from that studio in Illinois who were getting sick. Not because what they were doing was safe, but because it just took longer. However, the women started asking those in positions of authority at at the Radium Dial Company, is this safe? I mean, look what's happening in New Jersey. Is that going to happen to us? Is this safe? So what they ended up doing was they were like, listen, how about we just give you a medical exam and you can know for yourself that this is safe. Now, they didn't examine everyone. What they would do with their company hired doctor is they would pick the healthiest looking dial painters. They would give them a medical exam. These girls had not become sick yet. Maybe they were new at the job or whatever. And they would be like, see, she paints dials and she is fine. You don't have anything to worry about. So, and then they took it a step further and they took out like a full page ad talking about how safe the radium was. They were like, we are so confident that this is safe. We're going to go ahead and take out a full page ad and just let the whole, our whole community know how safe this is. And so, the girls in Illinois were becoming more aware, but those who were, those who were in positions of authority there kept telling them it's safe. However, it was also noted that when they asked, why aren't you showing us the results of our exams or our examinations? And the answer that was given to them was, if we showed you the result of your examinations, there would be a riot. Now, does that sound like these women were given a clean bill of health when they were examined? It really doesn't to me. But, what could they do? Well, let me tell you what they did. So, they had one employee there, Katherine Donahue. And she had been working there for quite some time, about 9 years. And she was sick. I mean, she had started as a dial painter. Then when she started getting ill, they moved her off the studio floor and into more of an administrative position, so she wasn't getting as much exposure. She didn't realize that was, that they knew why she was sick and they were doing their best to hide it. She just felt like, oh, okay, well, this is nice. I don't have to be painting dials all day. I love this. But what they did was, as she got more sick, they decided that they were going to fire her. And they basically told her, you're missing too much work. You're not dependable. You're too sickly. So we're just going to, thank you for your service to the company, but it's time for you to go. And they messed with the wrong woman. So in 1937, Katherine Donahue sued the Radium Dial Company. And as with the United States Radium Corporation, they would fight her every step of the way. They were not going to just accept responsibility for anything they'd done. They weren't going to accept responsibility for poisoning their workers, for lying to their workers, lying to the community. They were not going to have any of it. So they fought her every step of the way. Now, this was 10 years after the lawsuit that happened in Orange, New Jersey. And by the way, the outcome of that was a settlement. And I'm kind of confused here about exactly what happened. I do know that some women accepted the settlement, which was $10,000 lump sum, and then $600 a month, or $600 annually for the rest of their lives, which to us doesn't sound like a lot, but keep in mind this was like in the 1920s, so that actually is a significant amount of money. But there were some who, among the women involved in the suit, who were like, no, this is not good enough. You're killing me. You are literally killing me. And some of these women had families, and they were like, you're leaving my family without me. And you think that this lump sum, not only were they upset about trying to be paid off, but they also knew that if the United States Radium Corporation was not held responsible, they were not going to come clean about what they had done. And of course, as with many settlements, it was also noted that they did not have to admit any guilt. So it's my understanding some of the women took the settlement, some, continue with the lawsuit. And it was ultimately found that the court concluded that because in 1917, when the United States Radium Corporation opened, not as much was known about radium, except that one of the people who discovered radium said, hey, this could kill you. The court said that because so little was known about radium at the time, that the United States Radium Corporation was not responsible for the illness or deaths of their employees. So in 1937, though, Katherine Donahue sued the Radium Dial Company. So she had the benefit of having watched the lawsuit of the United States Radium Corporation unfold. And then 10 years later, she was able to use that knowledge, as was her attorney, to sue the Radium Dial Company and hopefully have a better outcome. But as you might have guessed, they fought Katherine Donahue at every turn. Now, Katherine Donahue was very sick. She was very sick, and she knew, as did everyone, that the clock was running out for her, that she, this had to be resolved. And she was just an amazing woman. This is a woman who, she had 2 small children. She was, she was married. She was deeply in love with her husband, and he was just deeply in love with her, and that didn't change at all, no matter how sick she got. This is a woman who would fight this massive corporation, regardless of how she felt. And this was also a class action suit, so there were others involved too. But Katherine Donahue got the ball rolling, and they fought her at every turn, but she refused to back down because she thought, I've got 2 children that are going to be without a mother. I can't back down from this fight. I cannot leave my children with nothing. And I cannot walk away without holding accountable the company that did this to me. So she fought and she fought and she fought. And ultimately, she found what felt as close to justice as she ever would experience with this case. And, her medical expenses were going to be covered. There would be an income for her family after she passed. And she felt like finally she could just rest and enjoy the time she had left with her family, knowing that when she leaves this world, they're going to be taken care of. But then, of course, the Radium Dial Company appealed, and Katherine Donahue would die soon after that appeal. She died in 1938 at the age of 35. By the time she passed away, she only weighed like 65 pounds. She actually gave her final testimonies in the case on her deathbed. So she couldn't handle the heartache of the company appealing, and she passed away. Her husband said that it was precisely because of that appeal. It was just too much. So they appealed. In 1939, the Radium Dial Company lost their final appeal, and Katherine Donahue's family would see justice. It's unfortunate that Katherine was not around to see it, but her fight ensured justice for her family, for the others who were part of the lawsuit, and for future employees. Now, the fight for justice by the Radium Girls led to the development of safety standards and regulations that to this day make things safer for people who are working in many industrial situations. If you've heard of OSHA, that is part of the outcome of the Radium Girls lawsuit. There was a lot more regulation that was developed concerning the handling of radioactive materials. Now, what's interesting to note is, as I mentioned earlier, progress in these things was made at the expense of marginalized people. Now, that is not unusual, but what's infuriating is in 1932, keep in mind, these lawsuits are going on. These companies are fighting these women at every turn. I don't know, I'm trying to get rid of that light in the background. You know, they're telling these women they're not really that sick, etc., etc. In 1932, there was a man named Eben Byers who had made a habit of drinking radium water on a regular basis. And he became very ill. And it was because of the radium water, and that was well established. And he ended up, no, he didn't file a lawsuit. Did he file a lawsuit? I think he did. Anyway, after he passed away, and it was concluded that Radithor, which was radium-infused water, was the cause of the poisoning, the U.S., or the FDA, immediately said, hey, you can't tout radium as medicine anymore. That was after one man died. And before there was any justice given for the dial painters, many women had to die. So the fight for justice in this case, and any progress made because of this, was absolutely 100% because of the victimization of marginalized communities, women, the poor, etc. And it, you know, it's sad that it had to fall on their shoulders to fight that fight, when all it took was one man's death to say, hey, you can't use radium as medicine anymore. You can't promote it that way. It's really just kind of disgusting. But again, this is typical. So in the fight for safety in industry, there's a long history of women and other marginalized people, the poor, immigrants, having to be the ones to take the brunt of the fall before any changes are made. The Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire, for example. In this, hold on. Okay, I'm back. So the Triangle Shirtwaist Company was a company that, as you might guess, made shirtwaists. And there had been, so they mostly hired women, and they hired, something's moving behind me. So spooky. Anyway, so they hired women, particularly mostly immigrant women who were working there. What they would do was they'd have these women go in to where they were making the shirtwaists, and they would lock the doors so that these women could not leave for breaks or whatever without those in management knowing. They had this massive fear that these women were going to sneak out for unauthorized breaks and so forth. So when the fire broke out, these women were locked into the building. They were locked in. They couldn't escape. And I believe it was around 125 people were killed from that fire. And what that ended up doing was creating a situation where it became very obvious there had to be regulations for safety in these factories. And specifically, the Triangle Shirtwaist Company tragedy helped address issues of fire safety, risk of personal injury, you know, and also, and I believe they also helped strengthen the case for unions, because if there had been a union who could argue, you know, who could speak on behalf of the employees, then this, you know, it certainly would not have been okay to say, hey, you know what, why don't you lock us in here while we're working, and we'll just hope for the best. We'll hope nothing happens where we need to escape quickly. That wouldn't have happened. Now, another incident, or another example is Phossy Jaw. And if you've not heard of that, it is the necrosis of the jaw that affected workers who were making phosphorus matches. And this situation was so serious that in 1888, the Match Girls, as they were called, in London, actually had a strike to try to secure safer working conditions for themselves. I don't know what that is. And unfortunately, that did not really change anything for them. But what it did do was lay the groundwork so that in 1906, the use of white phosphorus was finally made illegal. So that is the legacy of the Radium Girls. They helped create a safer working environment that, you know, we're feeling the impact of that almost 100 years later. Well, yeah, 100 years later. That's wild to think about. That the things that these women did 100 years ago, or almost 100 years ago, still impact how we live today and how we work today. So in March 1991, I mean, that's not where it all ended, though. Sorry, I didn't segue into that very easily. So there were ongoing things, though, that these dial painting studios left in the communities that they operated in. In 1991, the New Jersey Supreme Court found that the corporate successor of the United States Radium Corporation would be forever liable for the radioactive contamination of the community. They were told that they had to pay for the cleanup, and I believe that was finally complete in 2009. So think about that. So this is, you know, the company opened in 1917. In 2009 is when the cleanup was finally complete. That's wild to me. And for the Radium Dial Company, let me see here. Yes, for the Radium Dial Company in Ottawa, Illinois, the cleanup was still ongoing in 2019. Bearing in mind, they used a different process than the company in Orange, New Jersey, so maybe the cleanup process is different. I don't know. All I know is as of 2019, the cleanup was ongoing. Also, the communities where these dial companies existed, or sorry, these radium dial studios existed. You know what I'm getting at. I'm stumbling all over my words today. I think I'm kind of weirding myself out with the way I look on camera. But they had considerably higher rates of cancer in communities where these dial painting studios operated. So this is something that had a lifelong impact, not only on the women, their families, all their descendants, and it also impacted the communities that these dial studios existed in. No, really, in so many ways, nobody was safe from these dial painting studios and the impact it could have on the health of individuals and the community to this day, I would imagine. In 2007, a life-size bronze statue called Radium Girl was unveiled in Ottawa, Illinois, and it was really the first time anybody had made an effort to recognize these women. And the reason this happened when it did is because in 2008, I believe it was, there was an 8th grade student who was reading up on the Radium Girls and asked if, I believe she asked her dad if anything had ever really been done to memorialize these women who had sacrificed so much for the greater good, really. And his answer was, well, no, nothing's been done. So she put forth a relentless effort to make sure that these women were not only not forgotten, but that they were honored somehow. And the statue is part of the outcome of that. And it's dedicated not only to the women from the Radium Dial Corporation, or Radium Dial Company rather, but to all the dial painters whose lives were cut short after exposure to radium. They had never been told the truth. They had never been considered, from my perspective, they'd never been considered fully human and worthy of protecting by the corporations who employed them. And their tenacious fight for justice for themselves and for the future is something that's worth remembering. So that was why I wanted to tell this story today. So much of the progress that we celebrate and enjoy was made on the backs of marginalized people. And that is certainly true in the case of the Radium Girls. And their story is one that is worth telling. And if you would like to know more about this story, because I just gave you the bare bones and I stumbled all over my words the whole time, but if you'd like to know more about the story, I've left several links in the description that can where you can learn more. There is a great book out there called Radium Girls by Kate Moore. I loved the book. I read it in just a few days. It is a young adult book. You know, that's how it's categorized, but it was really good, very informative, and really tells these stories with so much heart and so much compassion. And I think if you're a reader, you'd really dig it. So anyway, that's the Radium Girls. I hope that you enjoyed this as much as something like this can be enjoyed. I hope it prompts you to just want to learn more about them, to, you know, really dive into the story, because I think it's one that's worth remembering, because we would be naive to think something like that could never happen today. It can, and I'm sure it does. And these are stories worth telling and hopefully contributing to a better future for all of us as we remember these people who gave so much in order to protect. It wasn't going to help them, and they knew that. They were doing it for the greater good, and that is something worth honoring. Anyway, thanks for hanging out with me today. Thanks for indulging my love for glowing makeup. I thought that was, I thought that was a great way to honor the women. And I think they probably would have enjoyed it too, because this glow-in-the-dark makeup is safe. Anyway, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will be back again really soon. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. Be safe out there. We are still in the middle of a pandemic, vaccinations or not, so be careful. And don't shit all over yourself or anyone else. There's enough of that in the world, and we need to be kind. And I will see you again very, very soon. Bye.